Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the News Behind the News with Ralph Kintab on Mix 94.7 FM, and thank you for joining me on today's program. This afternoon, I have here with me a Member of Parliament, D66 Member of Parliament at that, specifically in the Dutch Second Chamber in The Hague, Miss Jorien Wuite. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being on today's program.
Of course. So happy to be here with you as well, Ralph.
Great. So we've had quite a bit of interactions. I think this is the third one now on air. In order to thank you and welcome back to the island, although it's for a short stay. Yeah. But there's quite a bit of interesting things that we, of course, can speak about, particularly looking at the portfolio you carry as well, which is Kingdom Relations, Culture, and now the chairperson for the Permanent Committee on Foreign Trade and Development. So to begin, my first question for you is basically as it relates to basically in a year, that you've been serving as a Member of Parliament. What sort of reflections do you have, with the opportunity and experience serving the kingdom in such a capacity? Yeah,
the first one is, of course, humbling to be, having the opportunity to be indeed a spokesperson and a Member of Parliament for D66 with the portfolios of Kingdom Relations, Culture, and then also to be selected and chosen to become the chair, the technical chair of the Permanent Committee of Development Cooperation and Foreign Trade, which is therefore primarily a humbling type of experience. Being a Member of Parliament, representing therefore the people, having a legislative responsibility, supervisory responsibility towards government is a responsible job. It has been a roller coaster simultaneously, so new because of, as you know, I just reached. Mm-hmm. I had to learn in many ways, especially the specific political instruments that they apply in the Netherlands. And it also has been an enriching experience, enriching in the sense of being able to learn new things, being able to go in search of, making your contribution effective. In that sense, you always have to go in search of efforts and initiatives that last and make an influence in people's lives.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that first come to mind, even as I'm looking at your capacity as chairwoman of the committee that you're on, is as it relates to the war in basically Eastern Europe, between Russia and Ukraine. Because one of the things that first came to mind for me is as it relates to domestic production, but also, capacity and, well, not necessarily capacity, but the shocks that will relate to foreign trade, development, working with other multinational corporations or countries themselves. And so what factors, I guess, are you looking at, things that can probably concern you as well, as it relates to this area specifically?
First of all, of course, I just started as chair because I previously did the political representation of the media portfolio. So I just switched. Okay. So I engaged in a variety of activities, such as to chair the technical debates, technical briefings, roundtable conferences on a variety of subjects. But indeed, just like you said, even though that portfolio of foreign trade and development cooperation is not a high-profile responsibility, not for the Netherlands in terms of their interior priorities, but has raised in terms of importance due to indeed the turbulence and the insecurities following the war between Russia and Ukraine. So where you see that subjects such as indeed international trade agreements, rising food prices, oil prices, energy prices. It has a very disruptive element, but also on the other hand, the Permanent Committee is also, of course, engaged in matters such as humanitarian aid. So those type of subjects, where they are usually on a low profile, regular basis, has now heightened in terms of priority. Where you do also meetings with the Red Cross to ask for updates in terms of their involvement in the war, and how they're able to assist with humanitarian aid, and how indeed humanitarian aid that has been made available is put to good use. But in terms of your question, you have seen it, and that makes it very sensitive where we are now in the Caribbean and small island development states, where you see these huge economic shocks and insecurities that translates into rising consumer prices. That is even more sensitive towards islands such as Sint Maarten in terms of the small scale and their inability, for instance, to produce for the internal market. So, which is the role that I have is not a political representation in terms of being the political spokesperson on these subjects, but due to the fact that I'm the chair, you get informed and engaged in these type of subjects.
Understood.
So I do believe that this year is where we just came out of a pandemic with huge levels of insecurity. Now there is a new level of insecurity which is driven by economic motives, by matters of food security and scarcity. So, which is very concerning. Of course, it hits the continent of Europe first, but you see that this has been increasing. And you see that there has been great concerns about geopolitical shifts that are currently and have been currently already ongoing.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because even in terms of the food shortages and stuff, because one of the things I like to get into is climate change. But even before that, one of the an element in, there's a political shift of the world is rising nationalism. We see it even for us here in Ireland, literally next door, but also in Europe next door, being France, where a pro-nationalist, individual definitely performed pretty well. Although, not coming out on top.
Better than her previous participation, correct?
Correct.
Which says something about, all kind of shifts and developments on the European continent. But just like you said, nationalism, autocratic leadership, those type of tendencies and trends have been observed for a while already, actually, but has kind of accelerated these last couple of years. Maybe also due to the pandemic, of course, where there's insecurity. People have a tendency to maybe look inwards and look at themselves and their own primary needs and interests, and that then sometimes encourages nationalism and therefore protectionism as well, and therefore also the tendency to look at others as foreign and as
in a sense,
even at a risk. So that puts elements
greater barriers
at risk.
Yes, indeed. Because with that, one of the things that come to mind is the fact that based on the Dutch Kingdom specifically, but many European countries in general, there is still that diversity that cannot be ignored, because the history of the nation is not based just on the mainland, but the territories outside of it that it conquered and now are integrated into that national identity, the national scope of the territory.
Yeah, well, if you talk about the Netherlands as one of the 4 countries within the Kingdom of the Netherlands, they have their focus and their dynamics and priorities centered on the European continent. But if you look at the Kingdom of the Netherlands, consisting of 4 countries, including Sint Maarten, Curaçao, and Aruba, it has been concluded and observed that it has been neglected to the extent that it doesn't recognize matters of climate crisis. It doesn't recognize all other items related to security. And climate is now seen as an element of security and insecurity as well. Because it indeed further creates a divide and can be a factor that can further impoverish communities. So it has been concluded that there needs to be more collaboration, more focus on this item of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, but it requires four countries to therefore collaborate and prioritize things more than in comparison to the past.
Yeah. Now, even with that, one of the among our challenges or shortcomings has particularly been finances, specifically the islands and in the Dutch Kingdom. And so, going to my actual question, it relates to climate change, remaining a threat to the islands, particularly hurricanes, but even matters of water shortages and droughts, for example. So what sort of investments do you think can be made to shore up the standing position, of the region in time to come?
Well, first of all, I think what you can see in terms of the new government that recently this year has been formed, of course, and where they focus on a more extensive chapter related to the Kingdom of the Netherlands. You see that there is a more explicit focus on the needs to further secure socio-economic sustainable development. And one of the items that you then, for instance, see, and which also therefore then relate to the responsibilities I have as spokesperson for Kingdom relations, is that, for instance, the cabinet of the Netherlands recognizes, and the government just formed also, for which we are part of it, D66, emphasizes that certain type of investment funds need to be available and opened up to not only Bonaire, Saba, and Stasia as being part of being part of the Netherlands, but also open up to Sint Maarten, Curaçao, and Aruba, in order to facilitate that and really make it valuable for local companies and entrepreneurs. You need to then also ensure and question then, for instance, the government to see how can that be facilitated, what is necessary, should then the legislative trajectory be modified and adjusted so that it indeed becomes more and better accessible for businesses here on the island. Because if you need to make huge investments to indeed facilitate and further encourage and accelerate climate adaptation, you need to consider, for instance, indeed renewable energy. How would you, so that you rely less on the conservative oil and gas consumptions. Mm-hmm. So those type of factors need to be taken into consideration. And it is known that small islands and huge investments become very, very challenging to secure. Yeah. Especially recognizing that the economic kind of crisis, silent crisis, which was observed already in the entire Caribbean region, can therefore further intensify if you cannot secure funds necessary to make that transition. And those funds are even very challenging for the Netherlands to secure, and that's a bigger country. But it has to be accelerated. The Paris and international climate agreements have been made. The Caribbean Dutch islands did not adapt and take over those type of agreements, of international agreements. So how and why is that necessary? Should that be done? I'm happy, for instance, then with a motion that I submitted last year requesting that in the recent established agreement between the four prime ministers of the four countries and their agreement that they would meet on a quarterly basis, I requested via motion to see whether climate adaptation could be added as an agenda item, so that you can start to see whether climate adaptation can be a shared responsibility. Now, even also with, of course, upcoming consensus law, the COHO, and the reforms addressed there, questions that I've asked thus far and that I will consider to persist on is why climate adaptation hasn't been added as a factor and as a current problem that have to be factored in order to secure sustainable socio-economic development. If you don't recognize it, then I think we are being naive with one another. So those type of things, indeed, just like you said, need to be recognized and need to be prioritized to a greater extent. Also to, for instance, secure that climate change investment that needs to be made and maybe facilitated also via the European Union, that also is then made available and accessible for the Caribbean Dutch islands, which has been concluded that is not accessible. So all those type of things are now seen, and with the international climate reports that come out, the IPCC reports, of course, the small island development states are always recognized as more vulnerable. And if you're more vulnerable, you are more at risk for socio-economic downfalls associated, as I said, with the inability to make those type of investments. And that can then secure a further deterioration of your socioeconomic fabric, which are the risks that you have to overcome, because those type of factors, as you said, are real, acknowledged, and need to be translated in multi-annual plans by governments and priorities for investments. And if now, due to the impact of the pandemic, you're already weakened with huge debts, that gives it therefore the triple effect, making it very, very sensitive.
Indeed. Yeah. And now you mentioned the consensus law, which I would like to get into. But just before then, one of the things definitely like for you to expound on is some of the initiatives that you launched since becoming a member of Parliament. If you could share that with the listening audience as well.
Well, an experience that I've mentioned is surely associated with the first year of the experience and the skills and the knowledge that you need to gain. That's one factor that you have to take into consideration, recognizing, and reflecting on your level of effectiveness. The second factor I think that you need to also acknowledge is the fact that this has been beyond normal formation process in the Netherlands. The new government only got formated this year after more than 9-10 months of negotiations. That limits and influences your ability to be productive and effective as a member of Parliament. That's first and foremost. But I think I can be proud of the fact that I have been able to for instance, set the agenda for Kingdom relations. Whether debates were requested on certain subjects, it was usually done by me. Because, of course, the interest in Kingdom relations in the Netherlands is rather low. From small parties, even almost impossible, because they sometimes even have difficulty participating in some of the committee activities. So I think one of the things that I'm proud of is my ability to indeed ensure that the Kingdom relations remain on the agenda through debates, through I would say a knowledge agenda, which is an instrument not known here in our parliamentary democracies, or the democracies here on the Caribbean islands. But a knowledge agenda is there to also be informed as member of Parliament about various subjects. And I, for instance, requested also climate adaptation to be part of the agenda, to see how financing can be accessible to small islands. I've also requested the subject of the Article 73 in terms of decolonization process via the United Nations, and to be better informed about such a subject. I also wanted to know more about and place on the agenda the influence of what recently has been researched on the transatlantic slave system and the involvement of the Netherlands, and to the extent that therefore influences the relationship within the Kingdom of the Netherlands due to that very sensitive and tragic colonial but also slave trade historic reality. So those type of things are related to the knowledge agenda, and where it comes to setting the agenda by securing that certain type of activities take place. That's the second element. And the third element is related to, as I mentioned just now, with the motions. A motion that I just mentioned was like the ability to start the agenda on climate adaptation. But what was, for instance, more tangible for especially the citizens on the special municipalities of Bonaire, Saba and Statia was the increase of their minimum wage. By 10% since January 1st. Now, is that the end of it? No. Does it set the tone? Yes. I also tabled the motion to secure that the restoration of democracy on Statia would go into a higher and accelerated pace, because that is shamefully slow, so to speak, and has to be done, but is a neglected item, as I said, since especially the last 2 years. All focus is on internal Dutch matters on mainland the Netherlands. So setting the agenda for Kingdom relations, I think, is clearly what is part of how I campaigned also as an Antillian voice. So that's
also, you naturally have that connection as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So that is clear. And the other items associated with culture, I think one was the motion to secure kind of like a recovery plan for culture, because the cultural infrastructure was severely damaged, not only here but also, of course, throughout the entire world, but also in the Netherlands, where the cultural industries were damaged. People lost their jobs, their income, their savings, and it has been established through the macroeconomic analysis that was made that the cultural and creative sector was impacted more than other sectors, with loss of income of more than 25%. So I've requested a recovery plan, for instance, to secure an investment and a reinvestment agenda in the cultural and creative industry, so which I was also proud of. I also mentioned, for instance, and also set a knowledge agenda for the cultural and creative industries to ensure that it can be an expanding sector. Also in the Netherlands, people know me for this subject also here in Sint Maarten, but I also requested that young creative makers would get a podium and a platform in the political arena in The Hague, so to sensitize therefore politicians to the talents of creative makers, and therefore the need to also ensure that sector is worthwhile to recognize, to revalue, and to also secure in terms of an investment agenda. So those are some of the items through motions. The following 3 months, I anticipate, will be very important for Kingdom relations. The reason why I'm here is, of course, associated with the IPKO. Next week, even though we're going to visit Seba and Stacia as work visits, we will, of course, focus as of Wednesday on IPKO. Sint Maarten will be hosting. The subject of the consensus law, of course, consensus Kingdom law, will be a priority. And that will therefore also be a priority, we believe, in the months to come, in terms of what will be on the agenda. Will be on the agenda, and how can it be finalized in a manner that is satisfactory for all parties involved.
Okay. One more thing in regards to the motions initiated, were they all carried?
The one that I mentioned, yes. There was one that wasn't carried, or two actually, that were not carried, but the other motions that I've submitted were carried. Okay. It's a difficult political landscape in the Netherlands with 20 factions by now, so you always have to do the math and do the calculation in terms of having tangible effects, and securing the votes, basically, and then tabling a motion and getting a majority in Parliament or in the second chamber doesn't say that it's carried or executed. Then you also have to ask whether it's a state secretary or a minister, what's the progress? What have you done with it? And have you been able to implement it? And what are the effects? So it is sometimes overwhelming to secure the level of attention to all the subjects that you're responsible for, and to also focus on the priorities that you have in mind. I have. We are now, for instance, when I return on the 9th of May, we will get together as a faction. And we will get together to focus on each and everyone's portfolio and what the priorities will be for the remaining 3 years. Will you initiate a law? If so, what type of law? With what type of intention? How can you secure also then the capacity within the second chamber and within your own faction? How will you make it work? Will you initiate, for instance, an initiative? They call it an initiative nota, an initiative note paper. On which subjects and why? We just received now, with the new cabinet in place since January, February, their first line of action is always to translate the governing agreement or governing accord into a policy note that is submitted to the second chamber, in which they highlight in which manner the governing accord will be brought into practice by them on their respective portfolio, of course. So if we have a Minister of Interior Affairs, and for instance on Kingdom relations has been said that the democratic deficit needs to be worked on by considering and exploring possibilities to have voting rights introduced for Curaçao, Aruba and Sint Maarten. I would like to know, has it been taken up in the policy note addressing the priorities of the Minister of Interior Affairs, yes or no? If no, and which I've seen, it hasn't been taken into consideration, I'm going to ask questions and direct questions in terms of how will it be done, what can I expect, what can we expect within the second chamber in terms of progress on promises made in a governing accord. So, it is, as I said, an enriching experience. It is sometimes overwhelming with the tendencies, and you should know, because you're a media representative, of social media and media dynamics, with the tendencies to sometimes be preoccupied with things that are of the day or of the week. But you have to secure that you've remain focused on the things that you want to accomplish.
Yes, especially the long-term goals.
We are a member of parliament. We are a representative of the people. We have to secure that indeed the needs of the people are addressed and translated into tangible things that improves lives of families, of communities, and of, in the case of second chamber, the country at large. And I noticed that the dynamics sometimes of media and social media, where everybody wants to be visible, on all kind of platforms, sometimes this can be considered distracting, because there are a lot of news items that can catch your attention. Before you know it, you don't spend enough time on the things that require hard work behind the scenes, with a team that you're supposed to be working with on a dedicated level, on a consistent level. As I said, there are so many numerous subjects, and as you mentioned, a society in the Netherlands, but also here, that has increased distrust in government, societies that tend to polarize, play people apart, apply identity politics, may erode the system further, and those are things that I reflect on, especially also being a chair of a permanent committee. For instance, the Netherlands decided to establish a work group that had to analyze the core functions of Parliament, the second chamber, reflect on the extent that those core functions are secured and applied properly, or where there are areas of required improvements and where recommendations are concerned. So that is where everybody should be aware of the outcomes of such a work group, the recommendations that they've applied. Secure your legislative responsibilities, that if you have the responsibility to decide on new or adapted legislation, how can you also ensure that the law does what it's supposed to do?
Yeah.
And so you have multiple tasks and responsibilities. You have to apply that in a proper manner. Each and every one is responsible for everything of things that are handled within the second chamber, with, of course, your focus on your own portfolio.
Yeah, I got you. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back.
Okay.
Alrighty. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the News Behind the News with Rav Kintav on Mix 94.7 FM. And today I'm joined with D66 member of the Dutch Second Chamber, Ms. Jorien Wuite. So as mentioned before, you are part here on the island because of the IPKO, Inter-Parliamentary meeting of the islands of the Dutch kingdoms, not just the islands. But with that, what are some of the things you're looking forward to accomplishing for this year's session?
I think we were able to look back on a positive IPKO last year in August, which took place in Bonaire, and therefore the Dutch, we were the host, so to speak, because Bonaire, Saba and Stage are part of the Netherlands, and we were able to bring it here rather than on the European continent. It was positive. Why? Because I think we were all new, so new spokespersons in the second chamber on kingdom relations, new spokespersons for Aruba and also from Curaçao, because they had held elections last year. And Sint Maarten was, of course, a little bit advanced because they had already a year behind them, as the elections here on Sint Maarten were, of course, in 2020. So the first one was positive. So I'm hoping to have a similar positive tone that can avoid that hostility and divide and deterioration of the relations would happen, which we have seen in the past. There is an agenda, and Sint Maarten is the host, and therefore have been able to set the agenda. As I mentioned, de Caribische Organisatie en Hervormingsentiteit is Caribische Ontwikkelings- en Hervormingsorganisatie. That's the Dutch word for the abbreviation of COHO, of course. Has an important position on the agenda. I hope that therefore parties, Aruba, Curaçao, the Netherlands, and Sint Maarten are able to listen, to understand the positions on this matter, and to pose questions. So that we, for instance, all respective four countries are able to conclude the report for the first phase of the handling of the law. Because I believe we also need to have a good understanding of what consensus kingdom legislation means, and what it is therefore required in the weeks and months ahead. I think that is also very important to explore and understand of one another, because it's rather new. It's not legislation that is applied on a regular basis. We also see, for instance, in comparison to last year, where we have new spokespersons for the second chamber that were not there. That became spokespersons this year. There are members of parliament or of the second chamber that will visit the islands for the first time. So it's for their first opportunity to have a better understanding. And we usually see that once those visits take place on the island, there's more understanding and better understanding of one another's mutual references, context, and points of views are necessary to build bridges, and hopefully also secures something like a shared agenda. I hope we're also able to look back on the outcomes of IPKO last year, because certain agreements were made. So what is the status of the agreements made? Do we still recognize the urgency or the importance of those agreements made? Are we going to therefore also going to continue with those agendas? And are there subjects that we would care to explore? I, of course, brought in climate adaptation last year as a specific agenda item, so, which I will continue to do also this year. Yeah, as I said, my background is a bit different, so I have a more than average understanding in comparison to others. So I consider myself personally to be a bridge builder.
Yeah, I understand.
So as I would really like to see the One Kingdom, één Koninkrijk, un Reino type of idea applied to the best of our capabilities, as long as there is this construct of a statute and a Kingdom of the Netherlands. That we continue to explore what we have in common, where the four islands or the four countries are different, but let's see whether shared agendas can be encouraged. Shared agendas of social, sustainable economic development, agendas related to climate adaptation, fighting poverty, and last but surely not least, especially in the international context that we started off with on this interview, is whether the rule of law and the fundamentals of democracy is something that we want to uphold with one another, especially in a changing world. So those type of items will always need to be encouraged, will always need to be renewed, will always need to be explored. But on top of that, we are all different political factions. That means that ideologies sometimes differ.
Yeah.
And therefore ideologies also apply to the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Some political factions, may have a preference to leave the Kingdom of the Netherlands. That is to be respected and to be also to be considered and to be also exchanged. Others may want to see it differently or adapt it through a change in the statute. Or others would say, well, we would like to see a COHO, and others may say, I would never like to see a COHO. Some may say, let's work closely with one another, and maybe more than in comparison with than the past. And others may want to say, like, no, we would like to keep things as minimal as possible, so that there's maximum of freedom to have your own preferences and your own priorities addressed. So those type of things you have to acknowledge, and there are differences of ideas within the Dutch delegation, and there are differences of ideas and ideologies within the Sint Maarten or the Cursuline or the Reuben delegations. So that is also the essence of politics, of course.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Politics.
Yeah, so I hope that will also therefore be seen, so that we don't move against one another in terms of the Dutch versus the Caribbean islands, or so ideology needs to be explored, and there should be that level of freedom, that's freedom of and trust, to explore that in a respectable manner with one another, where you understand that you sometimes have different opinions. That's the essence.
And that's fair.
Yeah, and that's
okay. Because as you mentioned, one of my main questions for you was, as the COHO is definitely a headliner of the IPKO, and already it has received quite a bit of conflicting feedback among the various stakeholders. What's the position of your party where this is concerned, as far as the reforms?
Well,
and the body itself.
Yeah, well, I think before I became a member of Parliament of the Second Chamber, D66 tabled a motion to see whether other scenarios would be feasible than only a COHO as a consensus kingdom law. So that makes it clear. We want to work on the basis of solidarity, of equality within the kingdom of the Netherlands, and that should be and besides that, rule of law, of rechtsstatelijkheid, as they say in Dutch, need to be applied. So we have a critical view on what has been developed thus far, and the manner in which the process was handled, and that means that those type of questions, of course, will be tabled, will be brought to the table once we have to submit our report on the 13th of May. But I'm also going to use, of course, this moment next week to further consult and further review and see where there are opportunities to bring it further. Are we in favor of D66 of socio-economic sustainable changes? Yes. Are we in favor of a joint agenda to create synergy? Absolutely. So those are, I think, our points of departure, and now we have to see how that can be in a manner that addresses something as invented out of a consensus kingdom law, which is a subject already by itself kind of complex because it's not regulated properly. So what does it mean? But in the truest essence of consensus means consensus, and is consensus always you're able to get to the maximum? What I want or what you would like to have? No. So it's always based on we give and take, and where we see where we can meet each other with joint interest at heart. So will it be there? We don't know. Consensus is consensus, and is there that sense of you can say consensus, but it was never consensus because it was with a back against the wall type of feeling that has been expressed on numerous occasions. So I'm very much aware of that, and I've read the first version of that law still in lockdown on Sint Maarten. So I know I have a full understanding of the sensitivities, and I don't want to have a very extensive conversation here now, for instance, with you, because I want to have that openness.
Engage with your counterparts.
And really have that conversation next week. So positions not supposed to be taken in now, prematurely. I think it's this phase to explore and to listen and to see whether we move ahead and whether we move ahead with critical amendments that are necessary. Do you think that a piece of legislation that gets to the floor of on the Netherlands in the second chamber will have the same outcome as when it was submitted? No.
Probably not, no.
There are long lists of amendments to draft legislation, which is necessary, which is our responsibility. And that responsibility for the second chamber only starts now. Because even though that COHO as a draft law has been on the table for the last 2 years and have been negotiated between the levels of the state secretaries, the previous state secretary, and the prime ministers, now is the role of the second chamber. And I will always encourage also other colleague members of parliament, the second chamber, to do so same way as with other regular Dutch legislation.
Even in that equation, you had the report from the Council of Advice as well. The state,
Well, and their recommendations have been taken into consideration to a certain extent, and has been, of course, elucidated in the nota van wijziging and also in the memorandum of memorie van toelichting. I don't know the English word all of a sudden. So that's where it is acknowledged, but you can follow the trajectory over the last 2 years with the modifications made. And then you have to see, and is that sufficient, yes or no? I mean, there's draft legislation in many countries, including in the Netherlands, that takes for years. And do we see that the 13th of May is the end of it? There's even a second phase that can be acknowledged, which I heard of, in terms of, so how does legislation reach to ultimate decision making and plenary discussion or legislative consultation, as they say. So there are still many steps to take, just like with the regular legislation in the Netherlands. So, and amendments can be, of course, presented by the members of Parliament or the second chamber, but amendments can also be made by the governments. So therefore, in this case, the 4 governments, once they receive the reports of the 4 parliaments and with questions, but also with first positions, the 3 prime ministers and the state secretary will have to review those reports and reflect and analyze whether they will leave the law as is or whether they see the need to make amendments, and if so, which ones.
Yeah.
And then they can that could lead to amendments for the governments, and then we will get an updated version of the law, and then we would have to review it again to see if then on top of that we see more need for adjustments. So you understand the process. It's
quite a good trajectory.
Yes, and you have to acknowledge the importance of such a trajectory. You need to ensure that ultimately, and I thought that the work group that I referred to earlier, acknowledging the importance of quality legislation, is that you have to secure that the legislation that will come in place will secure the position of the citizens, because ultimately it has a responsibility for citizens and need to improve their lives. Look what happened with what type of parliamentary research has been done with the child welfare system, kinderbijslag, that has been in place in the Netherlands. That has been contributing to quite some conversations within our parliamentary system there, with the application of the law in a certain way that has been extremely damaging for certain type of families.
Yeah.
So you have to secure that it doesn't have a wrong impact. So those type of things will be considered within the COHO trajectory as well.
Yeah, because even with the latter part you mentioned, you see another body being involved, which was the Ombudsman. Yeah. So,
for instance, that is
the need for
another responsibility. That's a good question in terms of would an ombudsman have a role, and if so, which role once it is executed. I mean, the COHO is not a kingdom organ. It is a Dutch organ, but an organ that will have impact on the citizens here in the Caribbean islands. So all those type of factors play a role. It is a very complex law, and it has to therefore be treated with the utmost respect and seriousness to avoid that, as some people already sense, that it could be that it shouldn't fail. So critique is necessary, critical questions are necessary, and critical reflections are necessary. And that is exactly the task of a legislative trajectory, and therefore the ultimate function of members of parliament.
Yeah. And one of the things I think I would like to close off with is, because of course there's many more topics we can discuss, and I do enjoy speaking with you. But I do know that formerly you had media as part of your portfolio, and that has changed since January this year. But there's an ever-growing need for mass media's use towards empowering and educating citizens of what's happening around them, especially in the kingdom itself. So I noted the fact that yourself and Mr. Bijkert commissioned. You were commissioned by the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research to recommend the establishment of the Dutch Caribbean Research Platform. Yeah. And can you shed some light on that?
Yeah, I did that before I became a member of parliament, of course. I did that in 2020. I didn't do it as a member of parliament.
Oh, okay, because the way it came up when I saw it was as if it was recent. So
No.
Okay, my bad.
That report came out in 2020.
Okay.
And I concluded my activities before March. The work was done in 2020 as a side activity. I truly encourage, as I said, first of all, economic diversification of small island development states such as Sint Maarten, such as the other 5 Caribbean Dutch islands. And one of the ways to further encourage economic diversification is also through the establishment of more and expansion of more research. I think it's fantastic and phenomenal that the NVO, that institute, already put aside funds to encourage scientific research. You see that the University of St. Maarten has been involved. You see that Francia Guadeloupe is leading together with another group of scientists, a group of islanders at the helm. With broad interdisciplinary type of research necessary that can then also, in terms of outcome, be used for further issues of further development. So this agency that hopefully would be established and encouraged on all islands is, to my opinion, a very positive way in which you could say, how can the Kingdom of the Netherlands collaborate with one another in the area of education and research? There are much more opportunities, I think, that we can engage and explore rather than bickering against one another, with the eye on the future. And as a subject of media, as I know that you mentioned, I also ask questions with regards to how can media further be enhanced. Why? Because I consider media in terms of free press, freedom of speech, items of media and encouragement of democracy and involvement of citizens to be very, very important subjects, especially also in terms of the fragility that we see here on the islands, that it has to be constantly encouraged. That means that you have to indeed further encourage investigative journalism, that you have to consider to proper pay of journalists, that you have them available also on small scale, that you have to consider whether media should be media legislation and media financing through the government should be acknowledged by law. In the Netherlands, they invest more than €1 billion every year in local journalism, in regional journalism, in TV, in countrywide media, in investigative and qualitative type of media and journalism, and how that should be maintained, and the associations that's supposed to be formed to further encourage that, because democracy, freedom of speech, and freedom of the media go hand in hand. I was involved in international media organizations Islands, also considering certain type of trends in South America and Middle America, where journalists are under threat, are shut down, and are on the move even if their life is not even in danger. And you see that in Europe, you see that in China, you see that in Russia, you see it in South America and also in other countries, which is a very concerning development.
Even with the
those are factors which I hope that the Caribbean islands could also further encourage, because I do believe the Caribbean is a very, very critical region due to its location, proximity to the United States, in terms of all the small islands encourage and have democracy as their foundation, and how media can further encourage and secure that, and therefore also then strengthen media and the involvement of citizens is very important to support and a government responsibility, so to speak.
Yes, definitely. Well, I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time to be on the program. That definitely was insightful. And any final words before I close out? Yeah,
thank you, Ralph. I always admire you. I admire all young journalists that continue to opt for this profession. It's very critical that you do this work. I hope and I would like to encourage you to continue doing so. I hope you're also supported in Sint Maarten and in the entire region. Wonderful to see you again. I'm sure we are able to chat offline a bit further.
No problem.
And thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, great. And to our viewers and listeners, thank you so much for joining us on today's program. Joining me today on the program was Miss Jorien Wuite, second chamber, or member of the D66, a member of the second chamber in the Netherlands. So thank you so much again, and take care.